Welcome to 10 Minute Record Reviews, episode 284. And this time I'm going to talk about David Bowie's second LP, Space Oddity, from 1969. It originally came out on Philips. This is the 2019 reissue with a remix by Tony Visconti, who was, of course, the original producer on the record. There aren't that many differences other than the clarity of the instrumentation. The one exception in particular is the fact that the title track, which in the original version fades in over the first 8 bars, actually has a cold open right from the beginning, which I prefer because I've never been a big fan of fades in or fades out. It also adds the track Conversation Piece, which had only ever been a B-side, and it deletes the 44-second kind of blooper novelty track Don't Sit Down, which is no great loss. So this is Bowie's second LP, and it's the first one that has what you might call an actual Bowie-like rock and roll identity. But it's still transitional, and as others have said, this is still an era where he is as much reflecting other ideas that he's hearing in the musical environment as much as he is creating his own. It's a lot darker than his debut LP, probably because a lot had happened to David Bowie in that 2.5-year period. He'd fallen in love head over heels, he'd had his heart broken, and his father had died in January 1969, just a few months before they went into the studio to make this. It isn't a perfect record by any stretch, but it has some great music on it, and it's an interesting window into the emergence of David Bowie, the phenomenon. David Bowie was, of course, born David Jones in January 1947 in London, and he grew up south of the river, first of all in Lambeth, and then later on in his teen years in Bromley. He was charismatic and artistic in almost everything he did from the get-go, and from the age of 10, he was absolutely consumed by US rock and roll singles, in particular Elvis and Little Richard. As a kid, he was what you might call a musical omnivore. Like so many kids in that era, from Paul McCartney to Jimmy Page, he played in skiffle groups. He also had a half-brother who was really into jazz and introduced him to all of the, well, pretty much the cutting-edge jazz players of the day, people like Mingus and Coltrane. In 1962, he starts his first rock band, the Conrads. He then leaves in 1963 to join another group, the King Bees, whom he felt were a little more ambitious. The King Bees played straight-ahead British invasion-era R&B, think the Stones or the Kinks, around 1964-65. They end up getting managed by a guy called Leslie Kahn, who had originally hired them to play an anniversary party for some older folks. About 10 minutes into their pretty brash R&B set, he shuts the whole thing down, but he says, "Boys, I will be your manager." They accept, and now known as Davy Jones and the King Bees, they sign with a subsidiary of Decca Records, their pop label called Vocalion. And for Vocalion, in 1964, when David was 17, they make a single called Liza Jane, backed with a cover of Paul Revere and the Raiders' song Louie Go Home. Leslie Kahn ends up doing a lot to promote that record. He gets them on 3 different TV shows, including the Maud Staple Ready Steady Go, but to no avail, and the record flops, and they're dropped by Vocalion. Ironically, that record is now worth huge money because apparently Leslie Kahn's mother had a whole garage full of these singles, and years later she said, what should I do with them? He says, like 1971 or 72, throw them out. Well, they now go for like £1,000 a crack. Back to David, at this point he leaves the King Bees, and there follows a pattern over the next year or so where he joins a new group, they get a record deal, they release a single which flops, and then he moves on. So he joins the Manish Boys, which was another kind of Chess Records tribute act. Then he joins the Lower Third, who were a bit harder edged, a bit like the Kinks or the Who. He signs for Pye Records, who ask him to record his own songs, which also flop. He then has to change his name because the Monkees, of course, have emerged on the scene as a manufactured Beatles clone pop group with the lead singer Davy Jones. He then signs with Deram Records, which, just like Vocalion, is a sub-label of Decca Records, and he gets a deal, no less, to make an LP, not ever having had a hit single, which was kind of unheard of. And it's amazing how many chances David Bowie gets in these years, 64, 65, 66, 67, never ever having a hit, but constantly getting signed. And the theme really is that everybody can see this guy's got enormous talent and enormous potential, but nobody seems able to somehow bottle it and channel it and get it on record. Deram Records underwrites the production of his debut LP, the self-titled David Bowie, in 1967. As a record, I think it has its merits, but it falls well short of some of the better psychedelia of that age. I mean, that, of course, was the Summer of Love, 67. At its best, it's approaching some of the better songwriting of Ray Davies in the later 60s. At its worst, it's kind of like if the Strawberry Alarm Clock and Petula Clark did some kind of cringy novelty record. So some highs, quite a few lows. And in saying this, I know there are some Bowie revisionists out there who want to claim this retrospectively as a work of genius. They're entitled to their opinion. Personally, I'm not surprised it flopped. In the wake of this, Bowie is moving on from Deram Records. He's got a new manager, a guy called Kenneth Pitt. He's also head over heels in love with a woman, a dancer called Hermione Farthingale, which is possibly the most English name in the history of the world. He starts to work on some other projects. He and Pitt start to develop a film project called Love You Till Tuesday, which ends up getting released in 1984. Eventually, in 1968, Bowie gets seriously back into writing music again, not least because he and Hermione are no longer a thing and his heart is completely broken. However, the first piece of significant writing that Bowie does in 1968 is not a love song or a breakup song. It's actually Space Oddity, which of course is inspired by having seen the Kubrick film 2001: A Space Odyssey in May of that year. There are multiple demos and multiple versions made of this tune, which is noticeably, I feel anyway, darker than his previous stuff. And in particular, his voice is much more appealing now. It's lost that kind of cringy music hall quality, which was very English and would have made it almost impossible for him to sell records in the US. If seeing the film 2001 was a bit of a catalyst for his career, so was later in the year meeting his future wife, Angie Barnett. At the time they met, she was actually dating somebody else who was the head of Mercury Records' UK division, and through him and their connections, she manages to get the head of Mercury Europe to sign Bowie in May 1969, largely on the strength of Space Oddity. And in the summer of 1969, Mercury takes Bowie into the studio to make this record. The LP Space Oddity is made over the summer of 1969 at Trident Studios in London. On the record, Bowie sings, he plays guitar, adds a few other bits and bobs. He didn't have a regular backing band at the time, having taken such a break, and so on the record he's backed only by session players, the most notable of which is Rick Wakeman on keyboards and on that most 70s of musical instruments, the Mellotron. To produce the sessions, the label paired Bowie with a guy called Tony Visconti, and he'd go on to have a lifelong professional relationship with Bowie all the way to Black Star. But ironically, he could not stand Bowie's first big hit, Space Oddity. He thought it was a novelty record, he thought it was a bit crass, and you can understand this because the label was pushing hard to have it released before the date of the moon landing. So to produce that track, the label reaches out and taps a guy called Gus Dudgeon, who would go on to produce almost all of the early hits of another misfit with a flop for a first LP, Elton John. When this record was released, just like everything else Bowie had ever done, it flopped. The world was still not ready for the master. But they would be by 1972 when, on the strength of Ziggy Stardust, the record was re-released by RCA at that point, and it goes to number 16 in the US and number 17 in the UK. The record, of course, starts with the title track, Space Oddity, about which there's not much to say except that I love this mix of the song. It is one of the coolest songs ever, with Bowie's tremendously, deliciously ironic vocals and featuring one of the best acoustic guitar hooks ever written. That's followed by Unwashed and Somewhat Slightly Dazed, which I think is pretty good. It's kind of a psychedelic Bo Diddley sort of a track. Then we have Letter to Hermione. It's got very direct, very vulnerable lyrics, almost like he's reading pages out of his own personal diary. It's very moving. The last track on a pretty darn good side one is Signet Committee, which is a track which is great in points. It's got a complex arrangement, it's got a superb vocal performance. It's got a few things in common with Won't Get Fooled Again, that same kind of cynicism about the hippie movement which The Who had around the same time. Side 2 begins with Janine, which is a song about a mismatched relationship. The lyrics are interesting, the music less so. An Occasional Dream is alright, I think it's about a fling. I do like the next track, Wild Eyed Boy from Free Cloud. This is the orchestral version. There had been a single which just used a cello. I think both are pretty good. Next is Conversation Piece. Now this is a piece which had been a B-side, never included on the record before. This is about someone who lives in his head in a world of words. I think it's lovely. Next we have God Knows I'm Good, which is an amazing song actually. It's kind of a shoplifting rock opera. It could easily have been a Who song. Finally, to close out the record, we have Memory of a Free Festival, which, as the name suggests, is about a free festival that Bowie once put on. This is notable for having group backing vocals, which include Mark Bolan from T-Rex and Whispering Bob Harris from the Old Grey Whistle Test. But musically, it doesn't really get there. It's an attempt at writing a sing-along Hey Jude, but it's not nearly as good as Hey Jude. This is a record with one really great song, several other good, charming, or at least quirky tunes, and then a couple pieces where the idea for the song and the lyrics aren't really matched with enough musical craft to sustain interest. Some editing, perhaps by some more experienced producers, might have gone a long way. Overall, this is a record which, based on the title track alone, is probably a must-have. It's a record, however, of great moments rather than a great record. And for me, it's 4 out of 5 stars.